Okay, well, let's get started. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us today for another ICArEHB Dialogues event. I'm Dr. Sarah Rhodes. I'm a zooarchaeologist and a researcher here at the Interdisciplinary Center for Archaeology and the Evolution of Human Behavior at the University of Algarve in beautiful Faro, Portugal. As the final dialogue of the 2023-2024 season, we'll be discussing the topic of women in prehistory with an international panel of experts. I'm thrilled to introduce, firstly, Dr. Jennifer French, a lecturer in Paleolithic archaeology at the University of Liverpool in the UK. She's a specialist in the European Paleolithic and studies adolescence as a social and biological phenomenon in the Upper Paleolithic and the emergence of sex and gender roles in our past, as well as their relationship to concepts of power and personhood. Jennifer obtained her doctorate from the University of Cambridge in 2013 and was previously a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow and a Werner Gren Foundation Hunt Postdoctoral Fellowship at the UCL Institute of Archaeology. She recently published the monograph Paleolithic Europe, a demographic and social prehistory with Cambridge University Press. And since 2023, Jennifer has co-directed a research project entitled Concepts in Dynamic Assemblages, Cultural Evolution, and the Human Way of Being, funded by the John Templeton Foundation. Her work explores the technological concepts of containment and the role of containers in our evolutionary past, including the technology of infant carrying during the Paleolithic. She's also an active field archaeologist and part of the team currently excavating the early prehistoric site of Wogan Cavern in Pembrokeshire, Wales. Thanks for joining us today, Jennifer. I'm also thrilled to introduce Dr. Jyoki Wamai, assistant professor in the International Relations Department at the United States International University of Africa in Kenya. Jyoki is also a visiting lecturer at the Universitat Jaume I in Spain and an Iso Lomso Fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Sciences in South Africa. While Jyoki was a postdoctoral researcher at Cambridge in the UK, she was the founding president of the Cambridge Eastern African Society and the Black Cantabs Project, which aims to curate the achievements of Black Cambridge alumni. She's also co-founder of the African Society of Cambridge University and an alumni of the African Leadership Center at King's College London. Jyoki works in the nonprofit sector at the Kenyan Human Rights Commission as well, and at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Kenya. Her research interests include critical transitional justice, critical theory, the politics of Africa, African feminism, and the development of political thought in Africa. Thank you for joining us, Jyoki. And lastly, our internal expert today is Dr. Maria Ana Correa. She has a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from the University of Lisbon in Portugal, a Master's of Science in Human Evolution and Biology at the University of Coimbra in Spain, and a PhD in Biological Anthropology at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Maria Ana has worked as a forensic anthropologist for human rights groups in Brazil and recently held a postdoctoral position in archaeology at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. We are very lucky to have her join us here at ICArEHB as a researcher as of 2023 with the project entitled Early Diet Influence on Mandible Morphology, the Mesochalcolithic Case and the Effects on Human Adaptation, in which she is studying breastfeeding and weaning processes in the past. Thank you for joining us as well, Mariana. Thank you all for being here. Okay, to begin with, we asked our panel of expert speakers this question to get them started. Gender roles in the past, what were they? This is obviously a pretty difficult question, particularly as researchers nowadays tend to agree in general that gender is really a social construct rather than a biological definitive, and that it's largely influenced by social norms and expectations. For example, if we use this image by the well-known French illustrator Émile Béard of prehistoric man manufacturing flint artifacts, then we would conclude from this image alone that past gender roles clearly dictate whether you or I would have made flint tools. For example, clearly Obviously, only men made flint tools in the past. But this illustration, like all illustrations we use as academics in our presentations and our publications, are also a reflection of the social norms of the time when the illustration was produced. So mainly our Western ideas of gender roles in the early 19th century. So where do we start when it comes to identifying and understanding gender roles in the distant past? Jennifer, do you want to get us started off with this topic?
Yes, of course. Hi. So I do think that just this introduction has really kind of brought home the need to be specific and to define some of the terms we're using here. And in particular, to really emphasize that gender and sex are different. And when we're talking about women in the past, we are not necessarily also talking about gender or gender roles. And so you've raised the key point then that gender is a social construct, but it's worth us discussing this section, what we mean by gender. It's actually quite difficult to kind of conceptualize what we mean by social construct in this case. So there's lots of specific ways to define this, actually, depending on your disciplinary preference. One of my favorite definitions of this comes from within my discipline of archaeology. And this is from the scholar Roberta Gilchrist, who works in much later periods of archaeology, who define gender as the expression of social practices and beliefs about sexual difference. And I think this is a really nice kind of definition that encompasses lots of ideas about what gender is and how we might tackle gender roles.
Great, thank you. Maria Anna, how do you feel about gender roles? Would you agree with Jennifer?
Yeah, I definitely agree that gender is a social construct, but I think this is a great point at which to emphasize the difference between what is biological sex and what is gender. So sex usually refers to biological differences in things like sexual organs, chromosomes, hormones, etc., while gender refers to the social aspects mentioned by Jennifer. So gender is informed by biological sex, but is not confined by it. So when looking at the past, a simplified way to understand this is when studying the body itself, so bones or other remains, we are assessing biological sex. But when we consider this in conjunction with the material culture associated with that individual, we are trying to grasp gender. And I think another key point to bring to this discussion is that we're starting to move beyond the binary of gender of men and women, and we're also starting to move beyond the binary male and female, although this is an upward battle. So this graph from Scientific American, and it's meant to be confusing, is not meant for you to read it right now, just illustrates many of the ways in which chromosomes, hormones, sexual organs can interact to produce different expressions of biological sex, which again does not mean that most people will not be biological male or female. After all, sexual reproduction demands that two different elements come together to produce the next generation, but that variation exists and that it deserves recognition. So just a few examples. In the 70s, so bioarch people found that there were about 12% more male skeletons than females reported at archaeological sites across the world. And this seemed odd since the proportion of men to women should have been about half and half. And with time, this difference has subsided. And it seemed that is not so much the result of better osteological methods, but that we became more comfortable with indeterminate individuals, so people with unclear osteological sexual features. But of course, we've also developed new methods to look at this, and genetics can now tell us who is XX, so female, or XY, male. But it also finds deviations from this pattern. A famous example is an XXY individual, so Klinefelter syndrome, from early medieval age in Finland. So that's the first image you see there on the screen. And this person was associated with several objects, including a sword, which for that culture was traditionally associated with male burials, and jewelry, traditionally associated with females. And the image after that, just next to it, is from a very recent paper from this year that mostly reports on a new approach to detect chromosomal variations. So in other words, we are still developing the tools to detect this biological variation. And here what they did is they applied their tool to a few hundred genomes from Britain, and they found 5 different cases within a typical number of sexual chromosomes, which is not insignificant. So it deserves recognition again. But it's not only at the chromosomal level that we can see this variability in biological sex. For instance, in the Dominican Republic, huevedoches are assigned female at birth, but start developing male genitalia when they start puberty because of an enzyme deficiency. They were first studied in the 70s, and these individuals often go on to self-identify as men, although some researchers argue that they're recognized as a third gender. So again, this tells us a bit about the complex relationship between sex and gender. And at the moment, we are not really detecting these more subtle variations in biological sex in the past, let alone different conceptions of gender. And just as a side note, the study of this community in the Dominican Republic led to the development of finasteride, which is a drug commonly used nowadays for the treatment of baldness and enlarged prostates, which I thought was really cool.
Definitely cool. So there's lots of different ways that the study of different genders in the past can inform modern society. Jennifer, what about in your research?
Yeah, I think I really wanted to re-emphasize what Maria Anna was saying there, that this is wonderful and it's great that we recognize these differences, but the case studies that have just been shown are quite few and far between, and in most archaeological contexts we nonetheless basically we don't have the tools to detect this biological variation, which has implications for our understanding of gender as well, because biological sex tends to be recognized in gender systems in some way. And actually, I think what this research is showing us is that there's really myriad ways in which humans perceive and conceptualize gender and sex differences. And, you know, we're really only kind of touching the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we can find archaeologically. And I think that kind of leads me on to my final point here, which is that there isn't any clear transference of ideas we have about gender in the present back to the past, particularly to early prehistory. We should be really careful about transplanting our own ideas about gender back into the past, because that ultimately isn't very helpful if our goal is to study gender in the past. We're basically replicating what we know in the present in the past. So it's really difficult essentially to study gender in the past, particularly in very early prehistory, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. But nonetheless, I really want to kind of start this off by emphasizing that we should try. Gender is an incredibly important variable for those of us who are interested in humans and human societies past and present. So essentially anthropologists. It is a key structuring principle across living human populations, as well as an important part of individual identity. And the fact that we find gender as a structuring principle across basically every living human population suggests that it is therefore likely to have some really deep evolutionary roots that do stretch all the way back into prehistory.
Undoubtedly, I think it's definitely been a major factor throughout human history. But Johi, maybe you could give us a bit of an idea of how the modern perceptions of gender roles works with your research, with your areas of interest. Because I'm sure you can give us a bit more of an understanding of how our modern concepts of gender roles developed and how they're structured.
Thank you. I think first I want to go back to what Mariana was talking about, and I think both in terms of sex and gender. So with sex, as she mentioned, sex is biologically determined, and the only differences are maybe physiological and physical. but gender is a construct, a social construct that changes over time and space, both spatial and temporal. And I think the greatest mistake that was made by whether it's earlier communities was the conflation of gender and sex. And Simone de Beauvoir, the scholar, the French scholar, who wrote the book La Deuxième Sexe, or The Second Sex. I think this book was very, very important. Was it in 1948? In challenging that conflation of sex and gender, because when sex and gender is conflated, then there's no space for challenging this kind of this thinking that if you're male, for instance, the stereotypes that go with that a male means strong, means you can do the hard jobs. It means your space is in the public space. And if you're a female, it means you're weak and passive and you need to be taken care of. And your space is in the private space. So Simone de Beauvoir's work was very important in challenging that binary of sex and gender, and not just challenging it, challenging especially the conflation of the two, because that's where most of this past thinking, or whether it's current modern thinking, that women, the stereotypes that exist, women are expected to be weak and soft and because of that, they have to be taken care of and they are restricted to the private space, while men are expected to be strong and courageous and all the stereotypes that go along with that. And so it means they are fit for the public space. And that goes to showing why, for instance, we still have so many men in politics compared to women, or even in the academy. We still, in many of the faculties, we have very, very few women. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But first, conflating gender and sex is where our problem started from, and kind of detangling gender and sex and starting to see the nuances of each. And with sex, as Mariana was saying, increasingly, I think we have also moved from thinking about the binary. The dominant thinking has been the binary, male, female. And thanks to third wave feminists who believed in intersectionality and a lot of activism around trans and intersex, especially intersex, now that we're talking about sex. So now there's recognition of a third gender. I mean, a third sex, sorry, not gender. So a third sex, and it's very important. So we have moved beyond the binary thinking of male, female to a third sex, which is intersex. So that is very, very important. So I think we are making progress in many ways in the modern times to even show that biological variation. And also it's important that we recognize that understandings of gender, the what is dominant today, and based on those stereotypes that we are talking about, were really based, were as much as they became commonplace, but they were largely based on a province of the world called Europe, and so Europe exported the ideas of gender, of this strong man and the weak woman, and based on, of course, Victorian, whether it's Victorian Christianhood or Judeo-Christianity to the rest of the world. And it was exported, of course, through either religion, Judeo-Christianity, or through colonialism. And so gender roles defined by Eurocentrism, which had very, very clear, which were quite rigid. This is what men are about, men are expected to do, and this is what women are expected to do. This was exported to the rest of the world, both in gender and sex. Even with sex, that binary thinking, male, female, and there was no space for being in between. And so by exporting that, especially sometimes violently, of course, we know through colonialism, we miss the nuances and the complexities of the rest of the world. And I'm not saying, of course, still, even in the rest of the world, this dominant thinking was also dominant, but at least the rest of the world, and I believe the global south, like where I'm coming from, there was more fluidity when you think about sex. when you think about gender. So African context had, and you can see the different scholars from the books presented there. Oyeronke Oyewumi, Ifi Amadume, in her book, Male Wives, Male Daughters and Female Husbands, show that there was, both scholars show the misapplication of Eurocentric and Western ideas of gender, which are based on their own ideas of sex and the body, and how they were applied to the rest of the world, and they became dominant, especially due to colonialism. So there's need to also start, and not really another thing because they already exist, but also giving space to these other ideas of the world on gender and decolonizing how we think about gender.
Very interesting. Thank you, Joki. So speaking about this fluidity, how do we think the gender roles have changed in the past? What do we know about this? Maybe Maria Anna, you could start us off.
So I think a key point here, just paraphrasing a bit of what Joki said, is that we do know that gender definitions change through space. And we know Joki brought this idea about how it was more fluid in the global south. So we can use the same idea and apply it to the past. So if it changes through space, it changes through time. And it also overlaps and intersects with other sides of a person's identity. So gender, age, social and economic class, those would all play a role into how gender roles were performed in a way. And I think, like Joki was saying, so the Western worlds impose their version of gender roles to what we know now. So that idea of men as strong, women as weak, but this is not a universal experience, neither in time or space. I think that's the basic idea.
Yeah, Joki, would you agree with that?
Yes, of course, I do. And that's, I think, going back to this, not just the two scholars, not just Oyeronke Oyewumi and Ifi Amadume, not just in Africa, I think also in certain spaces in Latin America, in Asia, we've seen gender roles are different. For instance, right now we have, like you can see in the graph, the country with the highest representation of women in politics is Rwanda, again from the global south. And so you can see all the countries in blue represent the countries with the highest representation of women. And you can see they're mostly in the global south and of course in the Scandinavian countries. So whether it's Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Mexico, and the Nordic countries, which tells you something. It tells you something about how women are perceived in terms of their gender roles as leaders, while in many European or Eurocentric cultures, and also many African countries, as you can see, which largely also imported this idea, or rather received this idea of the passive woman, which was not necessarily the case before colonialism. So I think there is more nuance there. And you can see, for instance, we had Queen Zinga between 1583 to 1663, who was the queen of the Donga people, which is present day Angola. And Queen Zinga is celebrated for her leadership as not just a queen, but also a queen who fought the Portuguese for long so that she can liberate her country on her peoples, and also fought the slave traders. Remember that coasts of Angola, DRC was very active with slave traders, but she fought for a very, very long time and led her people of Donga. And there are so many other examples. We've had, I'm sure you have all watched The Woman King, which again is inspired by true events, which if you can see the women soldiers, the Dahomey women from Benin, present day Benin, which is the country that neighbors Nigeria on the western side. And so you can see that gender roles, as what we know about gender roles and this idea of the passive, weak woman in the private space, or what actually this idea of a woman's place is in the kitchen. Many of the African women were not in the kitchen. Many of them also had no kitchens, So they were busy. They were busy either as soldiers, others were traders, others were kings and queens. So that notion of the hierarchy and male hierarchy was really something that was quite present in Europe. And as I'm saying, the challenge is Europe, provincial ideas of Europe became universalized, which is a challenge. Became universalized through colonialism, through Judeo-Christianity. And so this becomes a challenge. And I think right now there's also a lot of trying to recall that and recall women's power. And like you can see, that's why we had this movie, The Woman King. There's another one, I think, a biopic going for the Queen Singer, to show that, wait a minute, these women actually were very, very powerful before. And it's time we reclaimed back that power. Yeah, and I'll stop at that.
That's great. That's a really great point, Joki. Thank you so much. So Jennifer, do you engage with this fluidity of gender through time and space in your research? Is this something that you also touch upon?
I mean, yes, I try to, and I think Yoki's points there have really just confirmed when we're thinking about the past, but we really need to resist the idea that there were universal roles of men and women in prehistory, because this isn't true today. It hasn't been true throughout more recent history. So why would this be the case in the deep past? But I do think there is still this idea that persists, that there are specific things or specific roles that men versus women did or played across early prehistoric societies. And I've got a kind of slide up here that just talks through maybe why these universal ideas persist for my period of specialism, which is the Paleolithic. So for those of you who don't know, globally, this is a period that spans from about 3.3 million to 12,000 years ago. And there is a very static view of gender roles throughout much of the Paleolithic. And there's three reasons for this, I think. The first is that it's just a bit of an overcorrection, basically. So it's nice that we're talking about women at all now, but we're talking about them in quite a static way in a lot of instances. So it's just this kind of big overcorrection to a long research history that actually hasn't really considered what women are doing in early prehistory at all. We also don't have very much direct data to investigate gender in the Paleolithic. It's by its name, it's the Stone Age. We have stones, we have bones. Later on, we have a greater increase in number of artifacts and diversity of material culture, but ultimately it's quite a slim database to be asking these sorts of questions. And from there, I think if we get a good example, or we find some nice direct data about what men or women were doing in the past, or maybe from there about gender roles, we just kind of extrapolate across time and place. And then finally, we lack a real robust kind of social and theoretically informed framework for thinking about gender in these very, very early human societies. And I think greater discussion like we're having here with people who think about gender in more recent contexts is a really, really good way forward here. But essentially, I think to kind of bring this background to what we know about men and women in early prehistory and what the kind of current state of play is, the outcome of these really static ideas is that we often have very simplified notions of what men and women were doing in the Paleolithic. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they default to a kind of mid-20th century Western model of idealized male and female roles and power dynamics. That's largely based on the historical context in which people were creating or writing these histories, rather than any specific evidence. So we have this idea that men are just basically the very center of social and economic life. And this is a I suppose, a stereotype that persists in both the professional and the public psyche. So we have men being the hunters in Paleolithic, the central figures in subsistence strategies and therefore social organization. And we'll come back to that in a little while. Men are also, generally speaking, or have been for a long time, widely credited as the primary manufacturers of things like the stone tools that I've got on the slide for you there. So this nicely shaped biface. If women are seen to be making stone tools, they're often making the more mundane, unretouched, less formal tool types. There's a long-standing idea, and again, we kind of debunk this a bit later, that men were the artists, the creatives of all of these great instances of parietal art we see later in the Upper Paleolithic in Europe. And then in contrast, we have this idea that women are just doing a lot less. There's a lovely phrase from a scholar called Adrienne Zillman that basically said that women are often described in this period as having faced a Paleolithic glass ceiling, where their contributions to social and economic life are basically limited to tasks that are compatible with pregnancy and child rearing. So gathering largely immobile resources, the manufacture of artifacts from organic materials, and then of course they don't preserve in the archaeological record, so we don't find them, so we then can't say anything about what women were doing. So these static roles as well also serve to make women invisible in a lot of contexts. And as we know from the previous discussion, it's also probably incredibly unlikely to be the case that we saw such rigid gender roles throughout the long history of this period. And I should say, in terms of the first point on the slide there, we are getting much better at including women in our reconstructions and our models of life in early prehistory. But there's still a little bit of work to be done. This is a recent reconstruction on the screen here for you from a scholarly article that was published this year. It's about hunting and human interactions with prey and other food resources. And you've probably noticed it only shows men in the reconstruction. So there's no women at all here. So this idea that men were at the center of life in early prehistory, and what that means in terms of men's and women's roles, and possibly also gender relations, really runs deep in our field.
Thank you, Jennifer. And that's a great example. So now that we've clarified some of our terms and discussed some of the challenges that come with trying to study gender through time, what about gender roles and power? Is this a more easily accessible area of research? Is this something we're still discovering and expanding upon? How do these two factors interplay in the past? Maria Anna, can you expand on that a bit?
I can try. Okay, so trying to relate this back to what Jennifer and Joki have also said, but bringing what Jennifer said about the Paleolithic, bringing it a bit forward in time. So I want to talk to this idea that women were constrained to the home due to childbirth and child rearing demands. And if possible, this idea becomes even more crystallized when we move on in time. So particularly the arrival of agriculture in Europe during the Neolithic is associated with a large population expansion, which is argued to have placed a bigger burden on women's time. You were having more kids, you were more stuck at home in a way. So the idea is that these would have cemented gender roles, and with the development of the state later on in Iron Bronze Age, that being sort of the final nail in the coffin, so to speak. So we're talking about theories on the development of gender inequality, this idea that women were stuck at home and that was their domain, based exclusively on European archaeological evidence. So these Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic brings the agriculture is mostly a European evidence. Other places such as the Amazon, where people did not practice agriculture per se, but instead established a complex and symbiotic relationship with the forest, we would not expect the same pattern, and we know very little about what pattern could have existed. So I'm going to go back to eventually later on to the actual archaeological evidence we have for this increase in population numbers and in gender inequality. But I want to talk a little bit more general on what we know about the impact of agriculture in current populations. And I don't want to use current populations as if they were relics from the past. So we cannot imagine that current forages were behaving as Paleolithic forebearers, or that farmers were behaving as Neolithic people. But even with that constraint in mind, a recent paper from 2024 found that although this varies, local dynamics are important. Individuals that engage in farming usually have a higher fertility. So this is a sort of a point towards saying that having more kids is associated with agriculture, and that makes women more dependent on help and more constrained to the home. So besides fertility, we can look at other factors. One is postmarital residence rules, which determine where a person resides after marriage. So in matrilocal societies, you would live with or close to the bride's family. And in patrilocal societies, you would live with or close to the father's family. And of course, if you stay close to your own family, you are more supported. You usually have less of a power imbalance. And these rules are also closely related with descent rules. So who inherits what? So in matrilineal societies, descent is traced along female lines. And in patrilineal societies, descent is traced along male lines. I think an example we can all relate to are last names. So my last name, Correia, is my father's last name. And my kids would have my husband's father's last name. So this is a patrilineal system. And again, looking at what's happening ethnographically, most groups seem to be patrilocal and patrilineal, although foragers in particular are more flexible. And matrilineal societies are not that rare. So if you look at the map here from this paper, you see the matrilineal societies in green. So they're not, rare. They're not something that it's not present there. And what this study from 2019 found was that matrilocalities specifically become destabilized by intensifying agriculture or animal domestication. And something else that also destabilizes these matri patterns are heritable forms of wealth, such as land, money, so essentially property. So overall, the ethnographical evidence seems to suggest that agriculture, and then later on the emergence of property and state organization, could have contributed to gender inequality. And I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Oh, no, that's very interesting. So potentially agriculture was the beginning of gender inequality, potentially. Joki, do you have any insight into I'm sure you have insight into the dynamics between gender roles and power in a more historic and global South perspective. Could you share some of those with us?
Yeah, sure. So just I would agree with Maria, Anna, and Jennifer that just like in those prehistoric societies, gender shapes power, and to date, or maybe in the more recent societies, you can see how gender. So that we remember what we say. Gender is about constructions. How is the social construction of maleness, femaleness, or masculinity and femininity. So gender shapes power. So to be a man, if you're a man, of course, it shapes power, and power shapes gender. Yeah. And so dominant understandings about gender, which we've seen, are quite problematic and erroneously brought erroneously conflated gender and sex. Also brings distinction. It also has broad distinctions between then the private space and the public space. and as a result, expressions of power. And where do we where are these expressions of power? Largely in the public space, as much as, of course, women or less powerful gendered identities continue to express power and challenge power through resistance, through their own agency within the private space. But largely when we talk about that power distinction, you find it is in the public space. And you remember we looked at that graph, or rather that infographic, where we are looking at women's representation across the world in politics, and you find that women are only at 26.9%. That's according to the International Parliamentary Union statistics of 2023, that big infographic we were looking at. And that's quite problematic, because women are even almost half and half, I mean 50-50, but they're only 26.9%. What does that tell you? It's because of these dominant understandings of gender, which have continued to shape power. And it's there, as we saw, they're erroneously based on this idea of sex. You know, the weak woman who needs to be protected from everything, even herself. And so she's restricted then to that private space. Hence, women have been relegated to the house and the household, and then men are allowed to go to the public spaces. And it's public, whether it's in decision-making, public, at the workplace. And so this is actually the dominant thinking about power. And this, of course, has brought its own set of problems and exacerbated gender inequality, because it means we have less women in leadership. Why? Like, that's what I'm saying, the International Parliamentary Union statistics, 26.9 women only, right? Very few cabinet ministers, for instance, less than, I think, 20%, according to that infographic. So, and the more we lose women in public spaces, the more we don't benefit, the more we also lose the benefits that having women brings in politics, in power, in leadership, and the benefits are immense, as you've seen. You can look at COVID, what happened. The countries that managed COVID best, like you remember New Zealand, were the countries where women, most of the time, they were women-led. So there are all these other challenges. Women are more likely to be interested in those welfare social roles, as much as, of course, that's very essentialist, but many times the research has found that women are more cooperative. I'm sure maybe if we had women as presidents right now or leaders in Palestine and Israel, or presidents of Ukraine and Russia, we probably the war would have ended, or we probably have not had a war. And I'm not saying women are pacifists. I'm not essentializing women. Of course, there are also women who believe in war and that kind of thing. But over time, it's been found that women are more likely to seek cooperative ways of dealing with conflict and this kind of issues. So gender really shapes power, and power shapes gender. And it's interesting also, just as I was arguing previously, it's important to look at the nuances and not universalize this idea of hierarchy that was brought by the Eurocentric thinking. If you look at the Global South and you look at the history in the Global South anthropologically, many communities were more egalitarian, right? And compared to the hierarchy that we see in the West. So just like Mariana was talking about, even at the family level, many, as you can see even from the graph right now, I mean the maps, the green where we have matrilineality is largely in the Global South. Lots of African societies were matrilineal. And so even families, entire families were named after women, so matrilineality and matrifocality, it was very, very common. But after colonialism, which again, as I said, this export of hierarchy and this idea of the male, the powerful male, which was not necessarily the thinking in the Global South, brought, of course, destabilized those communities, and then brought this idea of the surname. Many African societies did not have a surname. In fact, in my country, surnames came around because of colonialism and taxation. many people are named after their mothers because, of course, again, which is also patriarchal, many men were polygamous. They had different wives, and so the children only identified with the home was named after the mother. You're the children of this mother. And so surnames only came about because of colonialism and the position of heart tax. Every heart or house needed to be taxed by like the British, for instance. And so tax was imposed. And so the British then forced people to have a name that they could identify them for tax purposes and power. And so, and in effect, what this did is create then the hierarchy that existed in Europe, of the male, all-powerful male who is the one that everybody looks up to and who the house is named after. And so, and that of course brought other new challenges. And so I would agree that there are so many issues that this idea of power and gender and how power shapes gender and gender shapes power has actually, it was exported to the global south, and it has really become a mainstay, which was not quite before. I think you had powers in different, this idea of fluidity. You had powerful women, you had powerful men, but not necessarily just powerful men. You remember also, like, if we look at the hijras in India, who are seen as these were trans people who are very, very powerful before, again, this colonial encounter. And so I think there's need for more nuance on thinking about this.
Most definitely. I agree. Those are some really interesting examples that even I was not familiar with of the variability in gender roles and sex roles. So thank you, Joki. One of the things that stands out to me from this conversation so far is that it sounds like a lot of the evidence for power dynamics in the past would not have preserved through time. I mean, we very rarely find people's names in the prehistory or the Paleolithic. So Jennifer, what would you like to add to this conversation from your deep prehistory point of view?
Yeah, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there, actually, in the sense that actually I think this relationship between gender, men and women's roles, and power is actually one of the most difficult to access in early prehistory, one of the most difficult to access from the archaeological record. I also think alongside that, despite the fact that it's difficult and that we often lack direct evidence to really address this question of gender and power, we should resist assuming that gender inequality is a necessarily post-Pleistocene phenomenon that emerged with farming societies and was prompted by larger populations and increased sedentism. And we're finding recent research that suggests greater Pleistocene social and political inequalities than we previously supposed. And I don't think, although it's possible, we can necessarily assume that prior to the advent of farming, societies were necessarily egalitarian in terms of gender dynamics. I think that's something that we really need to kind of start thinking about in terms of this question of power and gender and how that links with women's and men's roles. And just kind of bringing us back to what Maria Anna was saying earlier about the use of ethnographic data to kind of look at this relationship between gender and power in the past. I think we also in early prehistory, we need to perhaps consider the possibility that there were social arrangements, that there were the gender dynamics, that they existed and that they lay outside perhaps of the envelope of what is known today. So Peter Richardson and Robert Boyd put this really nicely in a great paper back in 2013, the idea that we might want to consider that the Pleistocene was a world queerer than we've supposed. So essentially that there are elements of human societies in the deep past that lack easy modern analogues. And I think that perhaps gender roles and power might be a good place to apply that maxim moving forward.
Yeah, it's certainly possible that the deep past was a non-analogous climate culturally and environmentally, so not like anything we currently have. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, ladies. So let's move on to a topic that is very well studied then in the distant past and the Paleolithic periods. And this would be the division of labor. Jennifer, I know you've done a lot of work on this, so maybe you also want to get us started.
I say a lot of thinking, but perhaps the work is imminent, and there's a lot of scholars who've been working on this. This is very much a kind of hot topic, a key debate in this area. So essentially, this is the question of whether economic labor was divided by sex in early prehistory, and then what this can tell us about gender and men and women's roles, and also power as well. So I'm just going to summarize for you actually quite a large body of evidence. So I'll be necessarily brief, and then anyone can ask questions later on. But what we're talking about then, when we talk about the division of economic labor by sex, you might often see this referred to as the sexual division of labor. And the ideas about the sexual division of labor among early prehistoric hunter-gatherers draw heavily on the data that we have for this practice among recent foragers. And this division of economic labor by sex is really ubiquitous across contemporary hunter-gatherer societies and is characterized by two key traits. And these in combination are unique to human societies. So this is the idea that men and women routinely target different foods, and then they subsequently share them. And as you can see on this cartoon on the slide here, the different foods targeted by men and women are typically differentiated by the method by which they are obtained. So this dichotomy of man the hunter versus woman the gatherer broadly encapsulates the economic activities carried out by either sex in recent foraging societies. And here, hunting usually refers to large game, and gathering usually refers to the collection of plant resources, but could also relate to the hunting of less mobile prey, or the gathering or collecting of less mobile prey. So things like shellfish, tortoises, for example. Now, there's been a lot of debate recently about the validity of this dichotomy, about the validity of this man the hunter, woman the gatherer division of labor among hunter-gatherers. I've just put two examples on the slide here for you. So recent studies have questioned this, and the Anderson et al. Paper at the top there provided some examples or discussed the data related to members of the opposite sex typically engaging with tasks associated with the other sex. But generally speaking, there are exceptions. We do find instances of women hunting. Taking the data from recent and historical hunter-gatherers as a whole, this pattern of men hunting and women gathering is real and cross-culturally valid. So that's kind of the background. And from this then, one important question is, was this division of labor also followed in the past? So did Paleolithic hunter-gatherers follow this man the hunter, woman the gatherer pattern? And that has been the long-standing default position that this was the case because of the ubiquity of this sexual division of labor among recent foragers. And this has had the effect when we think about the relationship between gender and power, perhaps of ensuring the primacy of men in narratives of human evolution, as a lot of these narratives were historically focused on hunting as a key driver of biological and social change. However, when we look at the direct archaeological and paleoanthropological evidence for this division of labor in the Paleolithic, the evidence is really quite ambiguous. So in terms of, say, Neanderthals in Europe, the weight of evidence actually suggests that both Neanderthal men and women participated in hunting. We look at the fossil record, there are very few differences in the overall pattern and frequency of traumatic injuries between the sexes. And again, these might not necessarily be the result of hunting accidents, but given the risks of hunting large game, these were probably a contributing factor. We also have this very famous paper from Stephen Kuhn and Mary Steiner that was published back in 2006. that argued that Neanderthals did not have a sex-based division of labor. And they actually acknowledged the lack of direct evidence, and their way of addressing this question was to look for evidence in the Neanderthal archaeological record of activities that are traditionally carried out by women in recent foraging societies. So activities such as the gathering and processing of plant resources, small game hunting, working of organic materials, so basketry and manufacture of clothing and things like that. And they argued that because we don't find much evidence of these women's activities in the Neanderthal archaeological record, there probably wasn't this kind of separate domain of women's work. One thing about this is, of course, it's nearly 20 years since 2006. We do have a lot more evidence for those sorts of activities now. But the other part of their argument was that we do start seeing these behaviors in the archaeological record of the Upper Paleolithic. So when we see the first Homo sapiens in Europe. But again, when we look at the direct evidence for a sex-based division of labor for early European Homo sapiens, that evidence is likewise mixed. So we have things that we can look at, such as measures of levels of sexual dimorphism and limb robusticity, which have been used or have been argued as evidence both for and against different habitual activities of men and women, which are usually interpreted as the sort of repetitive actions related to large game hunting. One interesting thing, though, is that we do find lesions consistent with intensive throwing activities, such as the use of a spear to hunt, recorded more among Upper Paleolithic men than women. So there's a hint there, perhaps. But ultimately, while the evidence for a sex-based division of labor, men hunting, women gathering, is fairly consistent among recent and historical hunter-gatherers, the evidence we have for this specific configuration in early prehistory is ambiguous. And the question, I suppose, is where we go from here, because this is a big topic with all sorts of implications for gender dynamics and thinking about the relationship between gender and power. So I think one useful way to look at this question is to think about the reasons behind this split in economic labor, and see whether those reasons might also have been applicable in prehistory. And as we kind of touched upon earlier, explanations for this division of labor have traditionally focused on the reproductive role of women and the demands of childcare and pregnancy. And those demands would have been the same for prehistoric women too. And we know that hunting, especially hunting of large game, is dangerous. It would put the mother at risk. If she were pregnant, it would put the unborn child at risk. Likewise, chasing after large animals and physically confronting them as part of a hunt is difficult if you've got children in tow. And then there's this idea kind of underpinning all this, that women of childbearing age and their children are crucial to the long-term survival of a population. So this dichotomy, this division of tasks, therefore protects the demographic core of the group, kind of reducing their overall mortality risk. So we have this idea. The notion that a division of labor based on sex is demographically advantageous is theoretically convincing, but again, interestingly, when we look at the specifics related to fertility and women hunting among recent foragers, and admittedly the data are not extensive, it only receives partial support from the ethnographic record of recent foragers. So there's lots of other things going on here that we don't really have time to cover today, but biology has really been at the core of these debates for a long time now.
Oh, very interesting. Lots of room to develop and continue researching there. But I wonder how biological anthropologists approach this issue, particularly that you brought up of pregnancy and child rearing relating to the division of labor. Maria Anna, can you tell us a bit more about that?
I think that pregnancy and childbearing, child caring is very much the elephant in the room on this discussion of division of labor, because like Jennifer said at the beginning, the earlier androcentric studies use these differences in biology and reproductive roles to justify interpretations of the past in which men were active social agents and women were passive biological agents. However, despite this early misuse, being pregnant, having and caring for children would have been an important and unavoidable part of the lives of most women in the past. And on this basis alone, it should not be neglected as a topic of study. But as far as I know, we only recently have developed reliable methods to identify these sort of behaviors in the past. So a recent method is the study of dental cementum microstructure. So cementum is a calcified tissue that covers the root of the tooth and deposits in layers throughout life. So we know that stress events like pregnancy, but also systematic illness or starving, they leave marks on the structure, like the ones marked in not very visible purple arrows on the first image. And what this particular study found was that Mesolithic females had less stress layers than males, while in the Neolithic, females had more stress layers than males, although the variation in females was very high. So this lends credit to the idea that women were having more babies with the advent of the Neolithic, but they could simply be having more stressful lives. And again, this could be linked with an increase in gender inequality, but it would be the gender inequality sort of as we know it today. But again, this is one study, so we're still lacking sort of big data on this. Another line of evidence we are using are winning intervals. The basic idea here is that if you have more kids, you're winning your previous kid earlier, and you can use nitrogen isotopes to see the difference by comparing tissues that were formed during early life, like teeth. So here what you're doing is you're sampling along the tooth, and you can see the change in nitrogen isotopes. Again, this is a recent method, so there's no conclusive archaeological evidence on this, but there are a few projects targeting this. Something I think we can say and be sure about for multiple lines of evidence from primatology, ethnography, archaeology, is that humans have always depended on alloparenting, which is childcare provided by individuals that are not the parents. So it really does take a village to raise a child. And paraphrasing the demographer Rebecca Sear, this idea of a nuclear family with a breadwinner male and a female homemaker is a very recent invention that has nothing similar to it in the past, in the deep past, but even in the very recent past. And I'll leave it at that for now.
So I just wanted to jump in there as well, Mariana, to say I was really pleased that you mentioned demography, because I think that's really important in terms of thinking about the role and particularly the importance actually of women in the past, but also that question of division of labor that I was just talking about. I mean, there's this question, I mean, how big does your group need to be before you can divide tasks by sex, or indeed age, or any other kind of subdivision? And there's been a few recent studies on this, kind of mathematical studies, and a few other archaeologists have started talking about this. The idea that group size, so particularly this idea of a minimum size threshold, is perhaps crucial to understanding the emergence of the sex-based division of labor. And this idea is basically just, if we assume that the required skills and knowledge to carry out a particular specialist task are transmitted through social learning, if we divide those tasks by sex and we want to kind of maintain that division, it ultimately requires twice as many people to know how to do things to ensure the successful transmission of that knowledge down through the generations than if all people just learned to carry out the same tasks. So in very small groups, some form of skill specialization where only a subset of the group knows how to carry out a specific task could really leave the group susceptible to the loss of that knowledge in the face of the loss of a group member or the incapacitation of a group member. So in really small groups, the ability for individuals to both hunt and gather might have been necessary to ensure the continuity of that relevant knowledge and to ensure that sorry,
can't
did I
hear
just
you. Yeah,
sorry, I just went on mute.
sorry.
Sorry. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there. I was just saying that the notion of a demographic threshold to the emergence of a division of labor, I think is really key. We just probably need to think more seriously about the specifics. We do know that throughout the Paleolithic, group sizes were likely very small most of the time. So I think modeling the sorts of scenarios where it is more efficient and practical to have different skill specializations versus when it's better for everyone to share that knowledge base would be a really good way to move this line of research forward. Sorry about the accidental muting there. I hope you got most of that.
Oh, thank you for that really interesting insight. I honestly had never thought about demographic pressures as driving the division of labor, but that's a really interesting take. I'm pretty sure that in modern times we've reached our demographic threshold where we're no longer concerned about everyone in any particular group knowing how to do the most important key steps. So Joki, could you take us through maybe a little bit of how this works into your modern research, where the demographic threshold is obviously big enough for that?
Yes. So I think now in modern times, gender division of labor or sexual division of labor, because as we said, the biggest erroneous mistake that we seem to carry on is this conflation of the two, is the overrepresentation of women within only one of these divisions of labor. So Caroline Moser, a gender scholar, has classified the different gender roles, especially to do with division of labor, that men and women play, and that's the reproductive role, which is largely childbearing and rearing work, domestic work, basically. So whether it's taking care of the children, cleaning, and that kind of thing, productive work or productive roles, which is paid work, self-employment, or subsistence production, which really helps in advancing the person in terms of career now in the modern times. And then community roles, involvement in provision of items of collective consumption, voluntary work for the community. So if you do a gender analysis of most spaces, despite the progress we've made today in the modern times for women, we have better, maybe only in Scandinavian countries. And still, I'm sure even those who are in Scandinavian countries, women are still overly represented in the reproductive roles. And I don't mean giving birth. That one we know is sex, not part of the social construction. But other roles apart from giving birth or taking care of the baby, breastfeeding, are roles that anybody can play, domestic work in the house. So women are still overrepresented in the reproductive roles. We have, of course, in countries that have set policies that allow women to find the balance between their reproductive roles, either through flexible work or through all this, or through reducing the constraints that prevent women from getting to that place where they can do productive roles, especially by reducing, for instance, or supporting them, giving them subsidies to maybe pay for, maybe the state has a way where they help women with domestic work or whichever parent by paying for childcare and that kind of thing. So in many, not just traditional societies, but even in modern societies, as we are saying, women are largely overrepresented still in reproductive roles. Men, most of the time, will be in productive roles and will play very little very little roles in the reproductive role, and they will play community roles where it involves being paid. I mean, where there's a payment, right? But where there's no payment and is largely volunteer, it's the women who do the work when somebody dies, or when there's a wedding, or there's I mean, let's talk about COVID. We've just come out of COVID. Most of the women, even those of us who are here in highly in careers, we had to take time off and take care of people compared to what men could do. So despite the progress I think we've made, it's like, as we were saying, 2 steps ahead and then 1 step backward. So all these 3 gender roles, women continue to be overly represented in these communal gender roles, and there's need, and we hope that more can be done to maybe reduce that overburdening of women. And we said it needs to be at a policy level, it needs to be at a legal, changing the policies and laws in parliament, and also at a very private space where that would now need to be the people in the household choosing to have more egalitarian division of labor. So labor division, but also to say that as much as this is what Moza has argued, and it's not just an argument, is really an observation. If you do gender analysis using, whether it's the Moza framework or the different frameworks that do gender analysis, but especially on these gender roles, you'll always find women overly represented in reproductive roles and having very little time for their productive roles. And that's where this relates to the earlier issue we're talking about, gender and power. So if women spend all their time in reproductive roles and communal roles that maybe are unpaid or are not powerful enough, of course, we will have very few women in powerful positions, because also it's a time, each of these takes time, right? And so to release women to do productive roles, it means there's a cost to that. And so that cost is what needs to be taken care of, so that women can be released to do productive roles. And it's productive roles, not just and also communal roles, but communal roles in leadership, where they can be able to do some affect power. But as I was mentioning earlier, this labor division among women, and looking at these 3 Moza framework roles, is also not homogeneous. If we look at these divisions from an intersectional perspective, so it's easy to say, oh, all women are overly represented, for instance, in reproductive roles, but we find that labor division is not homogeneous, as we've been saying. It's not universal, but as much as we agree, most women around the world are overly represented in reproductive roles in the household. So, but it's important to always think about these things from an intersectional perspective. So women are not homogeneous, and these nuances exist along gender identities. So hetero versus other women who are not hetero, race, of course, and we know to the extent that women from the global south, brown and black women, are overly represented in these reproductive caring roles. And also now with the political economy and global inequalities, many women from the global south are moving to the global north to do care work, what is called the care economy by feminist economists. So care work is work that is mainly in the household, domestic work. So increasingly, as incomes increase in the global north, global north women are now moving to, of course, productive roles, but then pushing those jobs of reproductive and care work in the house to women from the global south to do care work, most of the time very low payments, sexual harassment in some households, and it's not just in the global south, I mean in the north, even in the global south, where some countries are richer than the others. So like in Kenya, we have really, really bad stories where young women who, most of the time, women from very poor households have moved to the Middle East to work as domestic workers, and they have been sexually harassed by their employers. They have been, underpaid or violated physically. So a lot of issues so there's this global South women, especially African women, I think are really at the bottom of this whole political economy of work around the world and division of labor. So they're really getting the worst, as much as there's a lot of progress. So it's important for us to look at labor division among women, not just as a very homogeneous issue. It is very intersectional, and there's a lot of challenges based on race, geography, ability. You can imagine women who have disabilities are not even likely to move from one place to another, and the kind of discrimination that they continue to face. And this ultimately, of course, affects power, because if you're not able to move to the productive space, that productive role, you're not likely then to have an income to be able to move to, say, political power and all these other issues we're talking about. But despite all these challenges, I think there's a lot of agency. We've seen a lot of agency, not just from women in general, women from the global South, women challenging all this, whether it's sexual harassment or low payment, low payment. And now that we're in this fourth wave of feminism called the digital feminist era, #MeToo, you have seen what hashtags like MeToo have done in creating a more egalitarian society for women in the workplace, in not ending, but at least beginning to address issues like sexual harassment, which are often harsh. But through digital feminism, Me Too hashtags, and all these hashtags, women have started challenging gender inequalities in the workplace and within an equal division of labor. So I'll stop at that.
No, thank you. Really interesting stuff. I think we can all look around in our own lives and see the overrepresentation of women, and particularly women of color, in reproductive roles or community roles versus productive roles. Although this exact event today is a bit of a contradiction to that. We're being very productive women on this panel. So to sort of switch the tone a little bit, but continuing with female representations, let's discuss a very common and very popular type of artifact in archaeological deposits, female representations from prehistory. So these would be artistic artifacts or even cave drawings that depict women or women's body parts. What is the current research on these artifacts or these images, and how it relates to these various dynamics that we've been discussing so far? Jennifer, can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So I'll talk a little bit about European Paleolithic art as my area of interest. And the first thing to note here is that in European Paleolithic art, depictions of women are much more common than depictions of men. And this has some really important implications for wider ideas about what Paleolithic art was for and for who made the art. And that brings with it some quite conflicting interpretations about what this tells us about the role of women in these societies as well. So I've got on the slide for you there the emblematic series of depictions of women in Paleolithic art, or what's been called the Venuses or Venus figurines. And you can see that I've crossed that out on the slide here. I just wanted to pause here briefly to think about that name before we go any further. It is very widely used in the scholarly and popular literature, but I will not be using it from here on in, and I do implore you all to do the same as well. So some really great work on why this is the case has been done by Jill Cook from the British Museum. So if you want to know more about that, I strongly recommend you read her work. But in short, the term has a really insidious racist history linked to sub-Saharan African women in 19th century European anatomy shows and demonstrations. And I think the most famous example of this is the case of Sarah Bartman. And it's also, so that reason alone should be enough for people to stop using this term. But thinking kind of theoretically as well, it's also not interpretively neutral. It has ahistoric classical connotations, and it also maybe implicitly prioritizes the interpretation of these objects as sexual in some way. And we'll talk a bit more about that, I think, later. So I'm going to call them Upper Paleolithic female figurines here. And just to kind of introduce you to these, really, we find some of these on cave walls, but they're most well known as a category of figurines of portable art. We find them across Europe, but most of them date to about 30 to 25,000 years ago. And they share several common features. So their raw material might vary, but they're carved from stone and ivory. They depict mostly unclothed women. Although we can see a little bit of clothing there or some adornment, particularly around the head. And they also show, in addition to the head, a special attention to the breasts and genitals. And that's really important because interpretations of these figurines have focused on the fact that they are largely unclothed and that their breasts and genitals are an area of specific focus. And within the wider research context of predominantly male archaeologists viewing these depictions through a predominantly heterosexual lens, traditional long-standing interpretations have been that men created these images. In fact, that just links in with the assumption that men created all Paleolithic art, and that these were created explicitly for the male gaze, and then they are linked to sexual arousal in some way. So there's some really nice concrete examples of this way of thinking. This is quite an early one. This on the screen for you here is the reclining Venus of La Madeleine, which was famously suggested by the Abbé Henri Breuil to have had the specific aesthetic purpose of, quote, but translated from French, giving pleasure to Paleolithic man during his meals. And then we have a much more recent example, and this is the news coverage in both the scholarly and public press that followed the 2009 discovery of the Hohlefels figurine in Germany. So I've got for you there on the screen some headlines from both scholarly journals like Science, serious broadsheets like The Economist, and then tabloids like The Sun, as well as a quote from a predominant archaeologist at the time, and almost all of them focus on this idea of sex, this being a very kind of sex-oriented object. So we have this idea that it was a prehistoric pinup with an explicitly, almost aggressively sexual nature, and that was from a working Paleolithic archaeologist at the time. That was, you know, the default interpretation of these images, and we're only now starting to see different interpretations of these objects, particularly the Hohlefels figurine.
If I can just jump in here, Jennifer, as someone who was lucky enough to work at Hohlefels for a number of years during my PhD, what I think really drives home this point is when you compare the media coverage and the academic coverage of the Hohlefels female figurine or Venus figurine with the coverage of the Hohlefels phallus, which was recovered a few years before the female figurine, but dates to around the same time period. As you can see, it most clearly is a phallus. It's obviously a male representation. But comparing these headlines with those that you just showed really brings home this message that it's very different when we're depicting men versus when we're depicting women, even if the depiction is literally of a man's sexual organ, whereas the depiction of the women is of entire women. So you can see the BBC News referred to the item as potentially having been used to nap or create flints. So that's obviously the use of the phallus from Hohlefels. Another description here by ABC News said, tool or not, the art piece is striking for a number of reasons. It's striking to me that it's defined as an art piece, whereas the Hohlefels Venus is defined as a pornography. I have to say there is at least one report that defines the Hohlefels phallus as a bit more pornographic, and that, of course, comes from the New York Post, which we all know is a pinnacle of journalism. But beyond that one example, that was the only one I could find for this topic. So just to throw it out there, I think when you compare the two, it really brings home this message you're making. Thanks.
No, that's mad, looking at the contrasting new coverage, and I really agree, actually. I mean, what's happened recently is that there's been a lot of research kind of pushing back against these interpretations of these female figurines, kind of highlighting how they are heteronormative and heavily biased by assumptions of what arouses present day Western men, and also ignoring several equally plausible alternative explanations, including, perhaps most obviously, the fact that they might have been manufactured and used by women. This is quite an influential, if quite controversial, study that I've popped on the slide here for you from the 90s that suggested that these figurines might have been obstetric aids to help women understand and track their pregnancies. So basically that the proportions of lots of these figurines related to various stages of a woman's life cycle, related to fertility and childbearing, and that they may have functioned as a form of self-portrait. So I said sometimes there's a lot of pushback against these sorts of ideas. There's often this idea of, what is the proof of this? And the standard retort really, in fact, when we're talking about a lot of elements to do with women's roles and gender in prehistory, is that we really have about as much proof as we have for those other interpretations, and of the idea that men made these and that these were sexy pin-up objects, but no one is usually demanding proof for the other interpretation. So yeah, I just kind of want to wrap up this kind of discussion on kind of women in paleo art by linking it in with this slide. I think it's the next one. It's a quite kind of very famous slide from the Guerrilla Girls art movement, which ultimately suggests that we are left with this idea that the only way that a lot of people see women being involved in paleo art is not as the artist or a kind of active agent in the creation of the art, but just as a nude depiction. And we do see that as well, kind of eking into present day artistic context, as you can see on the slide here.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Mariana, do you have any insight into this issue from your perspective as a bioanth?
Just as Jennifer was talking, I was reminded of the study by Snow in 2013, and he worked on hand stencils, which are relatively pervasive on cave art. So they've been recorded at sites across the world. And usually when we see portraits of this, we see them as being produced by men. But this study, what they did was they looked at the difference between the ring finger and the index finger, and usually men have ring fingers that are longer than their index finger, and for women they're more or less the same. There's an overlap between the sexes, but the basic idea persists. And he analyzed hand stencils from the Upper Paleolithic caves of France and found that most of the time the ratio was compatible with women. So of course there will be a lot of overlap, and since 2013 we've improved on this method, and now we can even differentiate between different ages as well. And this has been applied in a lot of different places, and mostly they have mixed results. Sometimes it's more men than women, sometimes it's equal, etc. But what does seem the general conclusion is that both men, women, and children participated in the production of cave art. And if we want to take this discussion sort of a step back, we can link to who is making art. We can also talk about what is art. So we've discussed men as producers of figurines and cave paintings, but these map very well into sculpture and painting, which are considered branches of fine arts nowadays. But there are other forms of human creation, so ceramics, embroidery, weaving, some of which Jennifer very briefly touched upon. but these are considered women's work, and so they're considered craft and not art. They're produced to serve domestic and utilitarian purposes, so they're seen as not in the realm of art. And this is an ongoing debate that goes beyond our expertise, I think, but some of the pushback against this idea is being led by Black and Indigenous women, namely by including craft techniques in their art, as this example that we see here on the slide. So I think this is something we can also bring to our own discipline in terms of starting to think about art, not just looking at figurines or cave paintings, but in a broader definition of what art is.
Great,
I think I'll leave it
you.
at that.
Thank you. Yeah, the difference between crafts and art is something that's always been a bit elusive and a bit hard to pin down, but there's definitely some misogynistic undertones there. So thank you for pointing that out. Joki, I'm sure that there's this dichotomy between craft and art in the groups that you work with and your research to some extent. How would you expand on this topic?
So yes, I totally agree with Mariana and Jennifer. But I think looking at today, what is going on, of course, there is that dichotomy, sadly, between art and craft, and then crafts. And sadly, it's crafts again from women from the global south that you can see they do not get really the recognition they deserve. So there are lots of ancient crafts from global south women, including what we call is it basketry, like the woman on the picture? I think she's a Kikuyu woman from my community, sewing a bag, what is called a kiondo, to pottery. We've seen a lot of pottery, beadwork. I don't know whether you know about the famous beadwork from the Maasai in Kenya, the Zulu beads in South Africa, textiles, when we've seen the role of women, especially in developing in this art and crafts in India, in Latin America, in many African countries, especially in West Africa, the batiks, the kentes in Ghana. And women art across all these cultures plays very many roles, including, of course, culture. If many of those fabrics, you'll be told this means something. It carries a culture. In Kenya, we have the people on the coast. They're called Swahili, the Swahili coast. And they use what you call, again, akikoi, ashuka, aleso, that also is used for transmitting messages. So they use the craft also to transmit messages between the community and also from one generation to another. So the cultures play, the art across the different cultures plays different roles. And I would say cultural, also providing a historical record. It's by going through why we are talking about the place of women through art is because we have those figurines, no matter how horrible they were and how they sexualized women, we have a historical record about how certain people thought about certain issues, and also artistic expression. And also it gives also symbolism for many things to do with cultural heritage. But more importantly, I think for also many women in the global south, it contributes to economic sustenance, because many of these women, because of already, and I'm glad we've already had that conversation to do with division of labor, because of being excluded within the productive formal or spaces or where they can make an income and become independent, many women do not have many formal jobs. And so the only thing they rely on for economic sustenance, and more importantly for independence, is the crafts through these bags or through the beadwork or textiles, or making sculptures and bronzes, as we saw, even the bronzes of Benin that are very famous, that are now being repatriated back to the continent, like in Germany, the Humboldt Forum. So women crafts sadly have never been taken that seriously. But I think for women, there's a lot of there's a lot of value these crafts provide, especially as I've said in the global south, that I'm well versed in, or in African context, especially economic sustenance. This is really the lifeline of so many women, and it gives them independence, and it's independence from so many things. Sometimes it's also independence from very difficult situations at home. There could be violence, but because she has money, she can make from the crafts, she can be able to live even a bad marriage. And healing through these arts, this is the only time women are able to sit together and maybe make something together. And through this, there's a lot of healing. So economic sustenance, independence, and healing are some of the added advantages that these crafts offer. But there's need, I think, this as Mariana was saying, the sad thing is many of this arts are seen as just crafts, and so downgraded, and so not taken seriously. And sadly, it's very interesting, because Western capitalism and the liberal market has now begun, or since maybe the liberal market economics became dominant, it has started, what do you call it? Appropriating these arts, and taking them to Western markets, or making them making them into these attractive commodities for sale to the highest bidder. And we've had even cases where there were issues of patenting, even of these traditional crafts from the global south. So those are the challenges, I think. And it's important to also to see now within the modern times how these crafts, especially crafts that were produced by women, are getting co-opted within the liberal market, and these women are not getting value for their money, as even when it's whatever they call, what do they call it, fair trade, is often not fair even to the women. So there's a lot that needs to be done to reduce that unfair trade regime, and also address issues of political economy, which of course are more to do with so many, policies and that kind of thing that address racism and gender politics. And because, as we said, this finally goes into issues of power. So I'll stop at that.
It always comes back to power, doesn't it? But that's a very good point. And it really is incredible that we continue to undervalue craft production as an artistic expression and as a community bonding and individual building activity, as you just pointed out. So thank you, Joki. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. Let's try to summarize it for the audience a little bit. We're going to end on this question: why is it important to study women in prehistory? I think we all know the answer to that, but let's give it to our audience. Let's discuss this together a little bit. Why, Jennifer, why don't you start us off? Why is it important to you to study women in prehistory?
Well, I think just to start with, I would consider it important in and of itself. I do think, if our ultimate goal is to understand past societies and past cultures, if we implicitly or explicitly ignore women, we're ignoring a huge element of that past culture. We can't really be seen to be doing a very good job of investigating anthropologically past societies if we do not consider women. But kind of thinking more broadly, and I suppose for perhaps the non-archaeologists in the room, I think it's important to study women and gender and the roles of men and women in early prehistory, because interpretations of those roles and of the behaviors of men and women in the past are very frequently used to support assumptions about gender and the roles of men and women in the present. And I do think here, perhaps counterintuitively, because it's so long ago, the Paleolithic gains some quite special prominence. So on the slide here, I've got a lovely quote from a scholar called Nathan Klimbara, who builds on the work of another archaeologist called Kathleen Sterling, who writes that in the Paleolithic, we are quite literally inventing human nature. So we, through our research, are defining what it means to be human. And that's really important, because if we ignore women, or we come up with some very stereotyped or poorly thought through conclusions about the roles of men and women in the Paleolithic, they, as we've seen, become deeply ingrained in both professional and public psyches, and then they become particularly susceptible to misuse in contemporary contexts, because we see this appeal to kind of an idea of naturalness of what people of various genders should or are able to do, and in terms of the relative imbalance of power between genders in contemporary societies, we find that these are often kind of justified and legitimized through recourse to a hypothetical, and as we've seen, quite often imagined Paleolithic past. So people say, oh, this is the way things are today because that is the way it's always been. And it's our job to kind of push back against that a little bit. Particularly as I've been discussing today, actually what we know for certain is very little about gender roles and the roles of men and women in early prehistory. So that's me on that, I think.
Thank you, Jennifer. Mariana, how about you?
I completely agree, and I think we can all recall instances of where this rhetoric of supposed past gender roles were used to justify or uphold current gender norms. Many movements even co-opt the language that we use in anthropology, archaeology, biology. So we have to be very careful when we research this about the language that we use. One recent example is this of Luke Maxing, which relates marginally to my own research, which is how I found it. But this is a movement of people seeking to enhance their faces with the goal of improving their sexual market value, namely by acquiring strong jaws and hunter eyes, which I thought was a really funny way to put it. And they do it mostly by, plastic surgery, but you also get tongue exercises. You have a special type of chewing gum or chewing devices to help you achieve the strong jaw. And of course, I'm electing to present here one of the less problematic examples, but I'm sure we can all think of a few others. And a lot like Jennifer was saying, having a more diverse view of the past is important so we can understand how we got here and the range of possibilities that exists. But even if we were to find in the past a very strong gender inequality and that was true for everyone, we should never use the past as a roadmap to how things ought to be. So this is a bit philosophical, but saying that something is good because it is natural or normal is simply a rhetorical technique which has no empirical evidence. So our research in archaeology and anthropology is never meant to be prescriptive of the present. It can help us understand how people dealt in the past with gender norms, gender inequality, or egalitarianism. It can help us understand how we got here, but they're not meant to be prescriptive. And I think those are the points I wanted to bring today.
That's a really important point, especially in light of such things as like the carnivore diet and some other popular media references to this naturalistic concept. Jokey, I wonder, I'm sure you can contribute something about how these gender norms, the importance of understanding past gender norms as a reflection of what's going on today. But could you, do you think you could sum up your take-home messages about why this is important for all of us here?
Thank you, and I totally agree with Mariana and Jennifer in terms of why. I mean, I think understanding the past is so important first, because as even I believe that's why when we have this the sustainable goal 5 is gender equality. It tells you why this is so important. And as you can see, gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, it's also a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. So, I mean, we all want, I think, a future or a sustainable world. So understanding the past shows us the continuities and also discontinuities, as I kept referencing, as if you remember, especially for the global South, where our ideas of gender is not just our own ideas, and it's now that we are busy trying to reclaim our own ideas of gender, is meshed with colonialism, racism, and I mean the whole idea of coloniality. And so it's important, as much as I know I'm just talking about the last 70, 80 years, not like what Jennifer does in the Paleolithic era. I think it's very important. And for me, I'm very happy to have participated in this as somebody who is not an archaeologist or a biological anthropologist, to see the past, because that past helps us understand the present for those of us who study the present or the recent past. So studying the past for me helps us see the continuities and also discontinuities, especially in thinking about gender. As you've seen, actually, there's a lot of changes that have come through because of many events or evolution, and those evolution, and of course other events that have happened. So understanding the past for me is very important, because it helps us understand where we are at and what we need to do for us to achieve this goal number 5, that prosperous, peaceful, and sustainable world. And also the cost of gender inequality is very, very high. Yeah, I've still not got statistics, but I'm sure feminist economists are hard at work in trying to understand, even every country, what is the cost of gender inequality. And I think we will, maybe in the next couple of years, we will have that we have already a gender index. And I believe there's a lot of research right now going on in different countries on the cost of gender inequality, because once it's quantified, I think policymakers will see, actually, this is very, very serious, because by having gender inequality, there's also there's the loss in potential of human development. So we need to see this as, and that's part of the reason I think number 5, sustainable goal number 5, talks about a prosperous future based on gender inequality. So the more there is based on gender equality, so the more there is gender inequality, the more we lose the potential of human development. So as humans, we are not likely to progress as fast, and also to where we should be, if we continue having women and other discriminated groups lagging behind. And so, and going back to where I'm standing from as the Global South, I think it's important we start decentering white Western ideas, not just of feminism, but also of understandings of gender, as we've seen, because these ideas are based on a real hierarchy that we need to decenter. And because as we've seen in the Global South, as much as there's a lot of gender discrimination of women, and there's also challenges to do with inequalities, it was more egalitarian, more fluidity. And so we need to globalize Southern ideas of gender. So I'll end at that. If we're going to achieve this goal number 5 of a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world that with gender equality. And I stop at that.
Oh, thank you very much. I think as most of us academics know, there is a cost to not engaging with 1/2 of the demographic in any realm that you're studying. And it's very interesting that there's quantifiable costs in the modern realm as well. So I think we all have the goal, especially here at ICArEHB, of avoiding those costs and trying to engage with all the groups we possibly can. So thank you again, Joki, for that insight. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. Now we're going to move on to the question period. So we're going to, thank you. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience on YouTube or from ICArEHB ourselves. So we have one question already from Javier Sanchez. How can we fight against preconceived patriarchal ideas spreading in prehistory? He says he finds it difficult to talk about gender and task division in the Paleolithic because of the nature of the archaeological record. This is a big question and a difficult one to answer. Jennifer, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. I mean, I do think kind of at least part of the battle is recognizing that we come with these preconceived notions about gender and sex when we kind of approach these questions. So just asking that question is a good place to start, I think. In terms of the sex-based division of labor, I think the key here is moving away from any assumptions which are built into a lot of previous research on this, that hunting is necessarily better than gathering because it is the big important thing that the men do. So rather than just trying to focus on instances where we might find women hunting, we need to think seriously about why we give that such primacy in the first place and where that idea comes from. And we did see, I kind of mentioned it briefly, that, you know, there are a lot of long-standing evolutionary models that put hunting at the center of lots of biological and cultural evolutionary trajectories. But we've also found research later in the 20th century that demonstrates that actually what has happened is that sometimes anthropologists have rejigged their definition of what hunting is to exclude women from that category because it fits better with kind of Anglo-American ideas of hunting as a very masculine activity. So we need to kind of move away, I think, in this case from thinking that hunting is the big, important, powerful activity, and gathering, because it's associated with women, perhaps is less important, because actually, just returning to the ethnographic record, there's lots of examples, kind of, I can't even think how many off the top of my head, but I'd probably hedge the majority of societies where gathering brings in the largest number of calories to the group. And also we find in the ethnographic record instances where women's contribution to other really important elements of life, you know, construction of houses, construction of clothing, not just, you know, those domestic tasks, but those things that are really fundamental to the survival of the group, increase as their gathering decreases. So in those groups which do have a greater reliance on the male economic activity of hunting. So these women are contributing in lots of other ways, and it is them kind of picking up the slack in those other ways that actually facilitates the men being able to go out there and hunt, because it's a time-consuming activity with lots of risk attached to it. So I think from my perspective, the key thing there is not imposing any kind of value on top of that division of labor if it exists, but accepting it in its own terms and saying, okay, why do we think one or the other of these is more important? Because I think that's predominantly where the patriarchal interpretations have really started to kind of muddy the waters. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to that.
So instead of finding new artifact types or a new way of analyzing artifacts, it's really just comes down to reflecting on how we are interpreting the use of these artifacts, reflecting on the biases we're already projecting onto.
I mean, I wouldn't say no to new data either, but I still think there's stuff we can do with what we've got as well.
Yeah. Mariana, I see you nodding along a lot. Do you want to add anything to this, or?
No, I was just agreeing with Jennifer. Sorry. I do think starting from acknowledging our own limitations is a first step. I was recently asked in a paper for a positionality statement, and that made us think about who we are, right? And I'm a white woman, mostly trained in Europe. So I'm going to bring my own biases. So it's about us admitting that we're not neutral in this. We're bringing our own biases to the conversation. But if we acknowledge them, if we acknowledge where we're starting from, I think that then it becomes easier to have different conversations, at least.
I agree. Great. Okay, we're getting all the heavy hitter questions today, ladies, so get ready. The next one is, if I'm reading this correctly, it comes from Emily Hallinan, who's also a researcher here at ICArEHB. I think it's touching upon the imbalance and inequality within academia itself. So she asks, how do constraints of the inherently patriarchal structure of academia today impact our ability to move research forward on these issues? So it's not something we've touched upon clearly, but I think it's been sort of in the background of our whole discussions. So she asked, how should we as a scientific community be tackling this constructively? And Joki, I wonder if you have any input on this, because we're talking now about our modern academic community and its patriarchal structure. You know, maybe fix academia for us today. Or do you have any insight on how we could make academia better with regards to these issues?
Yes, and I agree with the person asking the question. It's true that even for me, coming to academia, and I came from non-profit activism, working with women, it was very, I think it did not prepare me how patriarchal the space is. But I think we shouldn't give up, and that's what we are saying. How do we get more women in the academy? But also one of the things I've found within the academy, academic women don't organize as feminists, which is hugely problematic. And so if we can't organize, if you don't organize together, change will take forever. So, and the challenge with academia and all other patriarchal spaces, and I think I talked about that within the division of labor conversation, it's because of, again, this sex, gender, and the whole 3 gender roles, you're expected to come in as a man, right? And the more manly you are in your, or not manly, based on what you call masculinity, the more you exhibit masculinity kind of roles, you know. You can't even, if for instance you have a child, you almost make sure you don't say that, or you have to show that, you know what, I'm just here, I'm just like the boys in the group, and I'm going to show you I'm better. So I think that thinking is part of the problem, because we should get in, just like Jennifer was saying, get in as a woman and say, this is the baggage I carry. And so the system is meant to adjust to suit women in the academy. And so there's no way it will not adjust while we are just doing, we're not organizing. So there's a lot of organizing that, unfortunately, women in academia, we do not do. And so we need to organize, form, first of all, women and girls, or women students need to form associations, feminist wave students associations. Women in academia need to form, again, feminist faculty or women associations. They don't have to be feminist, but I think the whole idea is about feminism. That's why you're challenging gender equality. And then, yeah, organize. And then after that, challenge the spaces that are not including women, and not just including women, allowing women to be with everything they are about, so that a woman doesn't have to behave like a man or pretend to be a man. You know, if a woman has like 2 children and she's supposed to write like 5 journal articles in, I mean, it's impossible, you know? So there's
We
so
can all
many
agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, ladies. I could continue conversing with you about this topic for another hour, but we are running out of time. I'm sorry. Lots of thought-provoking ideas here, lots to take home, lots to apply to our own research. Thank you all for joining us again. I want to express the thanks from both the Dialogues Committee, so myself, Ana Rufa and Carlos Simones, but all of us at ICArEHB, and from ICArEHB in general. Thank you for joining us for this Dialogues event, and making it such an interesting one. This has been really a lot of fun. For our audience, keep your eyes on the ICArEHB social media accounts. This is our Twitter account, our Facebook account. I think we also have an Instagram account now. And we'll be announcing our next ICArEHB dialogue, which will be happening, right now it is May, so it will be happening in the fall of this year. Thank you again, ladies, for dedicating your time to this. I had a great time. I hope you did too. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. We'll see you all next time. Ciao.